In the heart of London, police stood before the cameras and announced what they called one of the most significant drug busts in years. But this story wasn't just about cocaine or cash. It was about two men blinded by arrogance. One believed encrypted phones and stacks of hidden money made him untouchable, a king who could run his empire in the shadows forever. The other filmed himself, boasting to the world that he was the Pablo of East London, convinced the streets were his kingdom. But arrogance always has a price, and when the walls finally closed in, their empires collapsed faster than they could ever imagine. Helios Nanaj's story doesn't begin with cocaine shipments or encrypted devices. It begins years earlier, long before anyone called him a kingpin or the mastermind of a nationwide drug network. Born in Albania, Nanj entered the United Kingdom as a teenager under desperate and uncertain circumstances. At just 15 years old, he was smuggled into the country, hidden in the back of a lorry, a dangerous journey taken by many in search of safety, opportunity, or escape. But for Nanj, that path would twist into organized crime. In later years, he would even boast that he'd been involved in criminality for almost 2 decades, an admission that would later haunt him in court. On the surface, he looked like any other man in London's working class, a construction laborer, a face that blended into the crowd. But investigators would later expose the truth. This was nothing more than a disguise, a thin mask hiding the scale of the empire he was quietly building. Behind the scenes, Nanj was moving in different circles. Slowly but surely, he climbed the ranks of both the Albanian and London underworlds, earning a reputation as ambitious, disciplined, and ruthless enough to rise higher than most. By his mid-30s, the teenager without papers had become a man with access to international supply lines. This wasn't a small-time dealer climbing the ladder step by step. Nanj's rise was fueled by arrogance and calculated ambition. He believed he could outsmart law enforcement, and he flaunted his success, often in subtle but dangerous ways. To some, he was a family man with a young son. To others, a businessman who enjoyed the finer things in life. But to the authorities, he was becoming clear, one of the most significant drug importers operating in the UK. By the time police finally turned their eyes towards him, Helios Nanaj had already laid the foundations of a multi-million-pound cocaine empire, an empire that would soon unravel, piece by piece. Behind closed doors, Helios Nanaj was no ordinary dealer. Police would later estimate that his network had moved between 1/2 ton and 3/4 of a ton of cocaine into the United Kingdom, a staggering amount worth millions on the street. His operation was meticulous. Using a web of couriers, safe houses, and trusted lieutenants, Nanj ensured that shipments from international suppliers flowed steadily into Britain. From London, his reach extended into regions like Gloucestershire, where local dealers kept the trade alive. Couriers moved drugs concealed in vehicles, often carrying several kilos at a time, while others handled the endless cycle of cash collection. According to investigators, Nanj could arrange deliveries of 200 kilos in one go, a scale of operation few in the UK drug market could dream of. His standing in the underworld was so high that even seasoned officers admitted there were very few like him. But this empire wasn't only about cocaine. It was about the life that came with it. When police raided his home in Wandsworth, they uncovered designer clothes and shoes worth around £40,000. Luxury cars, expensive watches, even a single Rolex worth nearly £10,000. For Nanj, the empire wasn't just about money, it was about status. He positioned himself as more than just a supplier. He became a mentor of sorts, guiding younger traffickers and showing them how to build their own import operations. He wasn't simply part of organized crime, he was shaping it. By 2020, Helios Nanaj had secured his place as one of the most powerful cocaine traffickers in Britain. But the same arrogance that drove him to flaunt his wealth and confidence would soon open the very cracks law enforcement needed to bring his empire crashing down. For years, Helios Nanaj operated in the shadows, convinced his communication lines were untouchable. At the heart of his confidence was an EncroChat device, the so-called unbreakable phone system trusted by criminals across Europe. For Nanj, it was more than a tool. It became the command center of his empire. Under the alias Boboku, the same affectionate nickname he used for his 5-year-old son, Nanj posed as a wholesale supplier. To him, the handle was just another shield of protection, but to investigators, it would become the key that unlocked his true identity. The phone told its own story. It contained family photos, birthday messages signed by the Nanj family, and snapshots of his personal life. In between, there were images of stacked cash, bricks of cocaine, and even selfies of Nanj himself in designer clothes and sunglasses. He bragged about having 1.6 million pounds in cash stashed during lockdown, money he couldn't safely move abroad. In another message, he admitted to supplying over 500 kilos of cocaine, even using the device to coach other traffickers on how to grow their own networks. What Nanj didn't know was what was happening behind the scenes. In May 2020, Europol and the National Crime Agency cracked EncroChat wide open. Overnight, the so-called impenetrable system became a goldmine of evidence. Every arrogant message, every careless boast, every incriminating photo from Nanj was now in the hands of law enforcement. In his confidence, he had kept a digital diary of his empire, and it was only a matter of time before those very messages brought it all crashing down. Helios Nanj's empire didn't collapse overnight. It began with what looked like a small-time bust, one that would trigger a chain reaction leading straight back to him. In May 2020, Gloucestershire police arrested Dimitri Genie, a local dealer supplying cocaine across the Gloucester area. At the time of his arrest, Genie was caught with 2 kilos of cocaine and around 60,000 pounds in cash. On the surface, it seemed like just another mid-level dealer taken off the streets. But detectives noticed something else in his possession: an encrypted phone. That single device turned out to be the crucial link. When officers finally cracked into it, they discovered it wasn't just being used for small-scale local sales. It was connected to someone far higher up the chain, an upstream supplier who operated well beyond Gloucester. And that supplier was Helios Nanaj. The timing couldn't have been more significant. At the very same time, EncroChat itself had been compromised, giving investigators access to the entire digital history of Nanj's alias. From there, detectives painstakingly pieced the puzzle together. They didn't just rely on the messages alone. They combined them with cell site analysis and ANPR camera data. By tracking how Nanj's EncroChat device and his personal phone always connected to the same locations, whether at his flat in Wandsworth or while traveling, they were able to prove both belonged to him. Among the logs, one message stood out with chilling irony. Nanj had warned his associates that he was pausing shipments into Gloucester because the area was too hot with police activity. He had no idea just how accurate he was. Local arrests, decrypted messages, and international cooperation were already closing the net around him. When officers finally executed search warrants, the picture of his double life came into sharp focus. Inside his Wandsworth apartment, they uncovered the luxury trappings we've already seen: designer clothes, watches, and cash. More damning still, seized devices confirmed what EncroChat had already exposed: Nanj's role in moving hundreds of kilos of cocaine and his desperate attempts to shift millions overseas. What started with 1 dealer and 2 kilos of cocaine escalated into the biggest drugs prosecution Gloucestershire police had ever seen. And at the very top of the chain stood Helios Nanaj, about to face the full weight of the law. But as his empire was collapsing under the weight of evidence, another story was beginning in East London, one built not on secrecy, but on arrogance, broadcast for all to see. In the crowded streets of East London, where drug networks rise and fall under relentless competition, Shahan Ahmed made his name in a very different way. Not through silence, not through secrecy, but through arrogance. At 34 years old, living on Theodore Street in Whitechapel, Tower Hamlets, Ahmed wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. Unlike other dealers who thrived in the shadows, Ahmed craved the spotlight. He filmed himself boasting, comparing himself to Pablo Escobar, the world's most infamous drug lord. In his own mind, he wasn't just another London dealer, he was the man who ran the streets, the one whose name carried weight across East London. He even went so far as to call himself East London's finest, not in whispers but in recordings later recovered by police. But the reality was very different from the legend he built. Ahmed wasn't running international cartels or laundering billions through offshore accounts. His reach was far smaller, just 3 drug lines, which we'll come back to shortly. Still, in that narrow world, Ahmed made himself a presence. Detectives would later uncover over 600,000 pounds hidden through business accounts, proof of the profits he was quietly stacking up. Yet what set Ahmed apart wasn't the money, or even the drugs. It was the ego. His obsession with Escobar wasn't about wealth alone. It was about image, power, and legacy. He wanted to be feared, But even more than that, he wanted to be known. In his own words, Ahmed bragged, 10 years in the gutter, on curfew, and I'm still rolling like Pablo. He saw himself as a survivor, a man who had risen from hardship to become untouchable. But in broadcasting that arrogance, Ahmed made the fatal mistake that seasoned traffickers avoid at all costs. He drew the very attention of the police. Beneath all the swagger and talk of being East London's Pablo, the true engine of Shahan Ahmed's world was far less glamorous. It came down to 3 drug lines. Branded under the name Killer, these lines were the backbone of his network, running without pause from December 2021 through to June 2022. In London's underground economy, drug lines are everything. They act as the bridge between desperate users and those supplying the poison. Customers don't wander dark alleyways anymore. They call or text a number, and within minutes, drugs are delivered. Ahmed wasn't the one standing on street corners. He was the one pulling strings. Behind him, a small but organized distribution model ticked away. His operation centered on Tower Hamlets in East London, areas already torn apart by entrenched drug markets. By keeping the lines open day and night, Ahmed ensured a constant flow of heroin and crack cocaine into the community. It was that steady rhythm, the endless ringing of phones, the constant churn of deliveries, that created the illusion of stability and power he loved to boast about. Each line worked like a business in its own right. The phones were passed between trusted runners, each one knowing their role. And with 3 lines running at once, Ahmed didn't just extend his reach, he multiplied his profits. For all his arrogance and the endless bravado, Shahan Ahmed was never as untouchable as he thought. Because while he paraded himself as East London's Pablo, the Metropolitan Police were quietly building a case designed to dismantle men exactly like him. It was called Operation Yamata, a long-running strategy to break apart London's drug lines and strip the so-called kingpins from the streets. Detectives had already mapped the reach of the killer network, tracking the 3 phone lines that funneled heroin and crack cocaine across Tower Hamlets in East London. Piece by piece, surveillance closed in. Officers watched Ahmed's movements, his associates, and the daily rhythm of his trade. The decisive moment came on the 28th of June 2022. At dawn, simultaneous raids were launched on 2 addresses tied to Ahmed, his home on Stead Street, Wapping, and another property linked to his network. What police found left little doubt. Inside were large quantities of Class A drugs, along with over 60,000 pounds in cash, piles of heroin and crack, bundles of illicit money, evidence that laid bare the scale of the killer operation. But it wasn't just the drugs and the cash that sealed his fate. Officers also seized multiple mobile devices and financial records, the smoking gun linking Ahmed directly to the lines. And on one of those devices sat the most damning piece of evidence of all, a video, the same recording we heard at the start of this story. Ahmed himself bragging into the camera. What he thought was proof of his rise became proof of his guilt, and ego turned into Exhibit A. By the time the raids ended, Operation Yamata had done its job. The killer lines were smashed, the devices secured, the evidence stacked neatly against Ahmed. But before we uncover the sentences that finally brought these arrogant dealers crashing down, there's one crucial gap we need to talk about, a missing piece of the puzzle that raises more questions than it answers. There's one detail that stands out when you place these 2 cases side by side. With Helios Nanaj, police uncovered the role of a single courier, Dimitri Genie. His arrest cracked open the doors to the wider network, but beyond him, the picture fades. We know hundreds of kilos of cocaine don't shift across Britain without couriers, drivers, stash keepers, and safe houses. And yet, in the courtroom, only fragments of that machine were ever brought to light. And with Shahan Ahmed, the gaps are even starker. His operation was built on 3 separate drug lines, a system that would have needed runners, phone handlers, and secure stash spots to keep it alive. But no arrests of those middle players have ever been reported. Instead, the entire focus fell on Ahmed, the front man, the visible face of the trade. It forces an uncomfortable question. Did the police really dismantle these networks? Or did they simply pluck the figureheads while the rest of the machine kept turning behind the scenes? In the headlines, the fall of a so-called kingpin looks like victory, but heroin and cocaine don't move because of one man. They move because of the dozens beneath him, the hidden cogs that keep the lines running. So was this the end of an empire, or just a disruption until the next man stepped up? What do you think? Did the police strike at the heart of the problem, or only scratch the surface while the trade quietly carried on? December 14th, 2023, Gloucester Crown Court, the end of one of the county's biggest drug prosecutions. For weeks, prosecutors laid out the story piece by piece: the encrypted phones, the messages, the money, the drugs, all of it pointing to Helios Nanj as the architect, the man at the very top. His defense tried to push back, claiming the phones weren't his, that he was just a man caught holding someone else's devices. But the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was too strong. Judge Rupert Lowe dismissed the story outright, calling it ludicrous and transparent lies. He told the court that Nanj was the organizing mind, the boss of a network moving devastating amounts of Class A drugs across Britain, a man whose choices enriched himself but destroyed countless lives, leaving even his own family facing decades without him. The sentence was heavy. Helios Nanj, age 37, of Smuggler's Way, Wandsworth, London, jailed for 24 years. His courier, Dimitri Genie, received more than 10 years. But the story didn't end there. 3 months earlier, on September 13th, 2023, at Snaresbrook Crown Court in East London, prosecutors had laid out their case against Shahan Ahmed. Unlike Nanj, Ahmed offered little in the way of a defense. The videos from his own phone told the story: the boasting, the arrogance, the self-styled Pablo of East London. The judge told him bluntly, drugs ruin communities, and his brazen celebration of the misery he caused was chilling. The result was swift. Shahan Ahmed, age 34, of Stour Street, Tower Hamlets, jailed for 9.5 years. Two men who thought they were untouchable. Two empires that came crashing down. But what do you think? Were these sentences enough? Did the police really take down the networks, or just the faces at the top, while the machine beneath them kept running?